Okay, maybe we will get started, and I think we'll probably have some more people joining us in a few moments. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. We're excited to have a panel to discuss the recent report by Fuanalytics on Brazil, Russia, India, and China attitudes to farm animal welfare. This webinar is being supported by the Grace Foundation, who also supported the research, and the focus is on the research done by Fuanalytics. You'll see it's a slightly unusual Zoom setup where you are not on the screen, just the panelists are on the screen, but you can ask questions in the chat feature, and I think either Che Green from Fuanalytics will seek to answer those questions directly, or we'll have a chance to put some of them to the panelists at the end. So the way this is going to work is that each of the panelists has a 10-minute presentation touching on one aspect that's relevant to the results of the study and to the question of farm animal welfare in the BRIC nations. And then we'll have a broader Q&A at the end of the panel. I'm going to provide just a little bit of background about why this topic is important. So I think a lot of us as advocates and as donors can become very focused on the US context, and this is a useful antidote to that. As a reminder, in terms of numbers of animals, about a third of the world's land farm animals and potentially about 2/3 of the world's farmed fish are in BRIC nations. And for the most part, they're already in large factory farm style conditions. It's not the case that this is still sort of pastoral agriculture or anything. Against that negative backdrop, there are some really promising results in the survey. I think the most surprising one to me was just that levels of support and concern about farm animals are remarkably similar across each of these countries, and even compared to the United States. So you look, for instance, at a basic question about concern for animals, where it said, do you agree animals used for food have approximately the same ability to feel pain and discomfort as humans? And what we saw in the results of that was in Brazil, India, and Russia, between 60 and 80% of people said yes. And that's the same range as in the US. The one exception was in China, and that's something I'm going to ask a little bit about later on. But I think across a number of these questions, you see a remarkably similar percentage of people concerned about these issues, and public opinion really seemingly in a remarkably similar place globally. So without further ado, I want to introduce our three panelists, and then I'll turn over first to Joe to present. So the three panelists we have on the line, one is Jo Anderson from Fuanalytics. She is the research director there. She has a past in academia and government, and she's now putting her social science chops to work for animals, working out the most effective ways we can help them. And she was the lead on this report, so it's going to provide both some insights into the report in general, but also I think perhaps a bit touching on Russia, especially. Next, we'll have Jim Harkness. Jim is the former president of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. He's also the former executive director of WWF in China and former Ford Foundation program officer there. So he has a lot of expertise in China. He now consults with a number of groups on China, and he's going to be talking about the China results specifically. And then last but not least, we have Shefali Sharma. She is the director of IATP in Europe. She has been the author and co-author of numerous reports on animal agriculture globally. Most recently, a set of reports I recommend you check out on their website about animal agriculture's contribution to climate change, and particularly some of the largest meat companies' role in perpetuating climate change. She also has particular expertise on Brazil and India, and she's written a number of reports on Brazil. She's going to be presenting on those two topics today. So first I want to hand over to Jo. Thanks.
Thanks, Lewis. So as Lewis already said, I am the research director at Fuanalytics, and I hope you'll bear with me for a moment while I get my slides up. There, how's that? Great. Okay, so as Lewis mentioned, I was the lead author on this particular study, but it was a big team effort, so I won't go into everyone who helped. But just to give you a really brief overview of the method first, you already know the study, the countries that were involved. We had over 1,000 respondents per country, which is important because it means when you're looking at the percentages that we're estimating, they're all accurate within plus or minus 3%. And this study was conducted in May, June of this year. It's also important to think a bit about where the survey came from. Because this kind of research is conducted in multiple countries, it's really important to think about how equivalent it is, both in terms of the translation itself and in terms of cultural interpretation. Questions can be interpreted differently depending on the cultural context a person's coming from. So we put a lot of effort into developing the survey in a way that is interpretable across cultures. And just very briefly, that meant that we developed the questions, first of all, following best practices for keeping them short and straightforward. Then we consulted with native speakers of each of the 4 non-English languages we used and people who lived in each of those countries to make sure that the questions made sense and didn't have any strange problems with them. Revised based on that. And then only then did we go to the translation process. And we used a process called back translation, which means that one person would translate from English into the target language, for instance, Brazilian Portuguese, and then a separate translator, without ever having seen the original, would translate back from Brazilian Portuguese into English. And then we can compare that version and the original English version and look for difficulties in how it was translated that way. From there, based on that, we consult again with native speakers, revise again, and had final consultations. So as you can see, we did as much as we possibly could to keep the surveys as equivalent as possible in spite of the 5 different languages that were used. So just to touch on some of the overall findings, key findings, Lewis has already introduced some of them, but so across all countries, as he mentioned, we saw very positively that the majority of people want improved animal welfare. Specifically, 71% of people on average across the 5 countries agreed that they wanted better animal welfare. And also found that a majority would support a welfare reform law in their country. But at the same time, we found across countries that most people don't agree that meat eating directly contributes to animal suffering. So as much as you're seeing these positive findings, you're at the same time seeing a relatively low level of personal responsibility being taken for the problems that we have with farmed animal welfare. Only 38% on average across the countries agreed with that statement. Also across countries, this probably won't come as a big surprise to those who have looked at previous research, but women were generally more pro-animal than men in their attitudes and their support for welfare reform. And another thing across countries, people tend to assume that others, their fellow citizens, are less pro-animal than they are. So for instance, if you see 71% of people saying that it's important farmed animals are well cared for, only 52%, a much lower number, said they thought the typical person in their country thought that that was important. Which is interesting in that it speaks to the privately held nature of some of these beliefs, that we might not be aware of how others around us think and feel, and that might be something that advocates can use to help their case. We also found across the board that more people were reducing their meat consumption than were increasing it. About 25% reducing versus about 20% increasing across the countries, and the rest staying about the same. And finally, because this was a cross-country comparison, everyone wants to know who came out the best. And in terms of the pro-animal attitudes, Brazil scored the highest on 4 out of the 5 more attitudinal measures, and second highest on the other one. So it was fairly clear that Brazil was the most pro-animal in terms of attitudes. So looking just quickly at results by country, and we can get into more details later, depending how the panel discussion goes. I wanted to start with the US just because it's a benchmark for the other countries and something that most people are already pretty familiar with. So we found in this study about 4% of people were vegan or vegetarian based on a consumption measure, not based on self-identification. And that the US was pretty middle of the range in terms of the countries for how pro-animal they were in their attitudes. So people from the US were generally less pro-animal than people from Brazil, but generally higher than people from India or China, kind of on par with Russia in the middle. And we found that there was a split in agreement with that statement that eating meat contributes to animal suffering. Only about a third of people were taking personal responsibility for animal suffering via meat eating. And another third said that it was not responsible for animal suffering. The rest were neutral. So there's a bit of a difficulty in the US with getting people to understand the impact that meat eating has on farmed animal suffering. But finally, we found that 62% of people in the US support welfare reform laws, which is particularly useful information with things like Proposition 12 in California, going through that this may be a viable means of change rather than trying to attempt personal diet change. So turning to the BRIC countries, which is why we're here, Brazil, as I said, had the most pro-animal responses of any country. But interestingly, at the same time, in terms of that consumption measure, only about 1% were vegan or vegetarian. So we think that this might be related to the importance of food culture in Brazil and meat within that food culture, that it could be harder to get people to eliminate animal products or even meat altogether. But that maybe there are viable options for instance, welfare reform law, where we found 70% of Brazilians, the highest number of any country, were in support of that kind of legislative reform. One final thing to note when thinking about Brazil, and indeed any country, is that different regions of the country may be different. So in particular here, we found that Northeast Brazil, people there tended to eat less pork and dairy, but more non-fish seafood. And that's important just for advocates. If you're trying to advocate for substitution, for instance, it's important to know what kind of recommendations to make based on what people are already eating. Russia was moderately pro-animal compared to the other countries, like I said, kind of around the same range as the US on average. And it also showed that same split in agreement that eating meat contributes to animal suffering. Some people taking personal responsibility, but a lot not doing so. And we also found in Russia that only about 1% are vegan or vegetarian there as well. But over half support a welfare reform law, which we think, again, suggests maybe going in the welfare reform direction might be more the way to go. Only 14% were opposed, so 53% support is pretty good, the remainder being neutral. There might be some room for movement there. India, as a lot of people know, has a reputation for having a lot of vegetarians and vegans. So it's interesting to note that although it had by far the most of any of the countries surveyed, it still wasn't a majority by any means. It was about 31% combined overall in India. And we found in conjunction with that that pro-animal attitudes were actually relatively weak, which we suspect is because most of the vegan and vegetarianism in India is religiously motivated, with Hindus being the majority of those people. So it's possible that religiously motivated animal product avoidance doesn't necessarily generalize to concern for animal welfare. It might be something that advocates can work on, trying to make that connection between religious values and animal welfare values. But right now it doesn't seem that that connection is naturally there to the extent we would probably like. And in India, we found, again, a little more than half supported the idea of a law for welfare reform. But that 18% that oppose is actually the highest of any country. And that's interesting to think about in such a vegan vegetarian country relative to the others, that maybe it's down to the dichotomy between for instance, the sacred status of the cow, but at the same time, the predominance of the beef export industry in India, possibly. And finally, for India, we found an age difference, that younger people were actually less pro-animal on average and less often vegan or vegetarian than the older members of the cohort. So this could indicate a potential troubling trend in India, such that people are less often vegetarian, less often caring about animals, but it's hard to say for sure from this kind of data, which isn't longitudinal in nature. And as Lewis already noted, when it comes to China, the thing that first stands out to you is the number of neutral responses in the data. This is actually a known phenomenon. Hopefully I'm not stealing your question for later too much, but that China is a country that's often referred to as collectivist in nature, whereas a country like the US is the epitome of an individualistic nation where people really want to stand out and express their opinions. Collectivist countries, generally more often people want to fit in and avoid the spotlight. So it has been shown in previous social science research that this can manifest in terms of choosing to remain neutral more often when asked for opinions. So with that said, I think it's really important when looking at the Chinese results not to put too much weight on the comparison to the other countries and to consider them more in their own right. For instance, just looking at the people who do express an opinion, positive or negative, you can see that there's more of a pro-animal tendency than an anti-animal tendency, which I think is meaningful. You also see in China, also related to the collectivism angle, that there's stronger evidence of social norms in action than in other countries. So whereas I mentioned that people in other countries tended to say that they were more pro-animal than others were, in China, those things actually went very much hand in hand, that there was a lot of agreement between how people saw animals themselves and how they thought other people did. And that's really useful potentially for advocates, because it means if you can present the data in such a way that there's the appearance of a pro-animal trend over time, you should expect to see that people would be more willing to get on board with that trend and act similarly themselves. And finally, for China, we found, again, that the older generation had more pro-animal beliefs and attitudes than younger people. And the same thing as for India. It's hard to know exactly how to interpret that. But one possibility is that in the past, because China is a relatively recently developed country, there was more of a connection between people and the animals that then became their food. It's harder to have a dissociation between your animals and your meat when you're staring it in the face every day, whereas younger generations of Chinese people are not as much engaged with the animals that they're eating. It is possible, although very speculatively, that that's one reason for this difference. And just in terms of the research angle on all of this, there's a couple of main ways that I would love to see this go in the future. The first is to get at trends over time, because there's so little data right now from any of these countries. And so just repeating this survey or a very similar one in the next few years would give us some really good evidence for changes over time, just to see, you know, as things continue to develop, how attitudes follow along with that. And the other is kind of the opposite approach, to focus in within one key country and try and get more data, deeper data, to speak to attitudes, behavior, barriers, motivations, things that people can use on the ground for advocacy work within a particular country. And as this panel, I think, is focusing more heavily on Brazil and China, those are also the countries that I would tend to recommend if we're going to take that approach. China because of the number of animals that would be impacted, and Brazil just because of the positivity of the results. It seems like it might be a little more receptive to that kind of approach. So I'll stop there with the overview, but I just want to put it out to all of our attendees that please feel free to contact me anytime. There's my email address so that you have it. And I will turn it back over to Lewis at this point.
Great. Thanks, Joe. That was really interesting. We now have Jim, and I think Jim doesn't have slides, but we'll be talking directly to you about China. Jim, I think you're muted. There we go.
Hello. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here this morning, and it was a really interesting report for me to read. My work in China has not principally been related to animal welfare, although this year and last I did some consulting with Compassion in World Farming on their China program and learned a lot through that process. But I was really interested to see this report by Faunalytics and have a few comments on the report and a little bit of context on China's animal meat consumption. As you probably all know, China's pork consumption is the highest in the world, both the total consumption and also at a per capita level. But that seems to be flattening out. And the same thing is true for poultry consumption, which has declined now for several years in a row. This is related, I think, in some ways to, first of all, in the case of pork, you know, you can only eat so much pork, and China's levels of pork consumption grew very rapidly from the 80s to the 2000s to a very high level. So I think that the fact that they're peaking now and flattening somewhat is not that surprising. But I think in the case of both pork and poultry, another factor has to do with the serious food safety scandals that have happened in China. And these have had to do with animal additives like ractopamine and clenbuterol. They've also had to do with you know, adulterated or unhealthy meats being served, sold to consumers. And the other factor there also is the repeated outbreaks of zoonotic diseases in China, and animal diseases as well. So you have avian flu and SARS, but also diseases like the African swine flu, which is currently spreading very rapidly in China. Also the blue-eared pig disease, which hit in the late 2000s. And so there's been a perception that those animal products may be tainted by disease as well as other food safety factors. There's also been a transformation in the meat production system in China that certainly IATP and others have documented very well. A move toward much larger scale, a reduction of backyard and small and medium production in favor of factory farming. And in the last few years, one big factor in that has been much stricter enforcement of environmental laws that have, in a very short order in 2017, forced the closing of small and large pig farms all over South and Central China. This process, which overall is forcing out smaller farms and leading to greater concentration and more industrial production, hasn't actually gone particularly smoothly. And I think that that is disrupting the market at the same time as demand is flagging for the other reasons I mentioned. Now, if consumption of pork and poultry is holding steady or declining, beef has become more and more fashionable in the last decade or two, and its consumption is increasing. And I think that's due, on the one hand, to the declining fortunes of other sources of protein, but it's also due to a sort of a general cultural sense that foreign foods are safer, that they're part of a more modern diet. There has also been vigorous and I think very successful marketing of beef by US, Australian, and other beef promotion associations, the Cattlemen's Association from the United States, as well as beef-centered restaurants and other food businesses. So if I had slides, I have a few pictures of things like there's an Australian chain now operating in Beijing, actually right next to a friend of mine's organic food store, that is a combination Australian butcher, beef grocery store, and restaurant. And they very strongly promote the fact that their beef is Australian and therefore of much higher quality than what you would get if you were having local meat. Along with a rapid increase in beef consumption is an increase in consumption of dairy and seafood. And that's coming with actually similar environmental and other costs than the increase in beef, and I think is tied to similar cultural and marketing processes. Now, Joe mentioned the sort of ambivalent attitude in surveys, I don't really have an opinion on this question. And certainly you're right, Joe, that there is a collectivist mindset that sometimes leads people to want to go along with what other people think and therefore opt for none of the above rather than express strong opinions. But I would say that in recent decades has actually been reduced as people have become a bit more outspoken, perhaps related to the spread of social media and people feeling like they have the ability to have their say in those types of fora. And I think there are also cultural and historical reasons related to the way China's morality and ethics have been transformed over the past 70 years. In the tremendous turbulence after the 1949 revolution, and especially during the Cultural Revolution, many of the traditional religious institutions that were associated with attitudes of reverence toward nature and non-human life forms were really completely wiped out by political campaigns. And they were replaced initially by Maoism and his radical vision of a society in which human beings completely dominate the natural world. You might be familiar with the crazy campaigns of the 1950s and 60s to wipe out all sparrows and rats and animals that might be seen as competing with humans for grain. Now, when the cult of Mao ended in the late 1970s, it was replaced by economic self-interest, really. That is what moved in to fill the spiritual void in China. And even in subsequent decades, as religious belief and practice has returned, it oftentimes has been a shallower, more transactional version of its former self. So nowadays, if you go to Buddhist temples in China, people are signing up to buy caged birds or caged goldfish or turtles, which they then will release for pay. And by releasing animals that have been kept captive into the wild, they are said to accumulate merit in the Buddhist belief system. But it's in that sense that it's happening. It doesn't seem to translate into life outside of visits to temples. There's not the carryover into daily life that one might hope for. And another factor, I think, is in China is that there is this tremendous concern for food safety born out of all of the food safety scandals that they've had and the very precarious status of China's food safety. And I think it ends up sort of swamping other considerations such as animal welfare. So people just might not even have the notion that you would think about animal welfare in their heads when they think about animal protein and food. But I think that this food safety concern does suggest a possible or strategy for efforts to improve animal welfare, and that might be by linking those efforts to improved safety or quality of foods. Just a tip for you advocates and funders out there. On the issue of older people being more pro-animal in their beliefs, I would agree with Joe's suggestion that this may be related to the very rapid economic development and urbanization that has happened in China over the last several decades. So that just 2 generations ago, upward of 95% of people in China were rural and grew up living with animals at all times. And now less than half of the country lives in rural areas. So I think that probably is a strong factor. And I think that, harking back to Chinese traditional values, along with portraying animal welfare as something that is modern and, the way to be a globally responsible modern person, both seem like promising strategies going forward for animal welfare advocates. Those are my comments for now, but I look forward to our discussion.
Great, thanks, Jim. So now Shefali, and I think Shefali is going to focus more on Brazil and India. Thanks.
Let me unmute and let me try and share my screen. Here we go. Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you guys. This is the cover of our report that we launched last year called The Rise of Big Meat, Brazil's Extractive Industry. And actually I'm going to spend my presentation talking about Brazil because 10 minutes is too short to cover Brazil and India. But I'm happy to talk about India in the questions if that helps. I call this an extractive industry because essentially it is that, and especially when you look at the Brazilian context, the toll that the rapid increase of beef production and now increasingly poultry and pork and dairy in Brazil has taken on the environment has been proportional to what we would call the extractive industries. But I want to bring your attention to this slide, which we compiled this data last year, but actually even this year as I was preparing for this presentation, the numbers still pretty much hold. Brazil is the largest exporter of poultry in the world, the largest exporter of beef in the world, of soybeans, second in maize, and fourth in pork. So the animal agriculture sector is really critical for their economy. And I'll go on to talk a little bit about that, but also the role of exports has been very significant in the animal ag sector. Brazil's production, exports, and consumption of major meats continues to grow. So I found it very striking, Joe, in your presentation about Brazilians being the most friendly towards animals, but they really do love their meat. And they continue to love their meat, even while they're demanding that production practices change to reduce suffering of animals. But even as we speak, the USDA predicts that there's going to be an expansion of feedlots in 2019 for beef by 10%, which is pretty significant if you look at the numbers, the amount of beef that is produced in Brazil. And what's particularly striking about beef is the number of scandals that the biggest producer in the world continues to face, which is JBS. It's the largest meat processing company in the world. It dwarfs the second largest, which would be Tyson. So you can only imagine the amount of meat this company produces. But both of their CEOs were jailed last year, and one has just recently gone into jail. And yet they continue to profit and expand. I'm giving away my future slides, but maybe this cuts down on the time. Poultry, again, continues to be the largest, their number one export. They're the largest exporter of poultry in the world. And consumption of poultry also continues to rise. What I found interesting about pork this year is that there was a certain sudden dip in production, exports, and consumption this year. They still stay number 4, and it was mainly because of lower higher feed prices, which made the cost of production expensive. And this is expected to rebound next year. So I want to talk a little bit about how some of the biggest companies in the world are Brazilian companies. As you can see, this is top 10 from 2011 to 2016. The 3 that are highlighted are Brazilian. And that's because the Brazilian National Development Bank actually created a policy whereby they funneled money, and actually they still continue to hold shares in JBS, to actually create national champions. And as you can see, their development policy and their subsidies to the sector actually worked. If you look at the amount that JBS was producing in 2011 and what it was producing in 2016, it's doubled its quantity. And BRF didn't really exist before 2008, around 2009, 2010. And then all of a sudden it's, you know, a big player in the global market, and it continues to rise. So BRF went from number 9 to number 4, and it continues, and Marfrig's another one. So this not only created national champions, but also international champions. So JBS's increase in food sales increased by 195% in 6 years. JBS is the one in red. And so you can see how it outperforms all the other big meat processing giants. And I think this is a really important element to think about Brazil, and to thinking about what would a strategy look like that would address animal welfare concerns, given the huge role that the corporations play. You know, these are the dominant meat processing corporations in the world. So what would a strategy look like that entails that kind of an understanding and the hold that these companies have within the government, whichever government? Speaking of governments, Brazil just had a very big election. I'm sure you've all heard, he likes to call himself the Trump of South America. He's there in the middle, and he's Bolsonaro, and he's surrounded by the Bancada Ruralista, the agribusiness lobby, that were all too happy to support him and his rise. Although last week he was thwarted in his attempt to merge the agriculture ministry with the environment ministry. This was, of course, going to be disastrous for the Amazon, which he's clearly said he wants to put a big road through and basically industrialize and expand. So, but surprisingly, this move of merging the 2 ministries was met by opposition from many of the agribusiness lobby, except for the cattlemen. I mean, so for them, I think they would have been happy about it, because that would have meant undermining any of the progress Brazil has made in trying to secure, you know, the Amazon and reduce deforestation. But many of the other folks, like the soy industry and other crops, they were not actually interested in this move. So he's gotten opposition from both sides. So that's actually good news. But it remains to be seen what's going to happen on this front next year. And I think his support for agribusiness is going to be pretty strong. So this is going to be a big challenge in the coming years. And this is reference to JBS. This is a news from last week. Josley Batista was one of the CEOs, and he's been arrested again. So the corruption probe continues. And interestingly, Bolsonaro's big platform for getting elected was anti-corruption. But he's also been documented. I had to translate the Portuguese articles. He's also been documented getting bribes from JBS. I mean, JBS has been involved in bribes of, I think, I don't know, what was the number? Was it 19,000 officials? I mean, it was a pretty significant number of officials that they bribed. And Bolsonaro was one of them. So I'm not sure what he's going to do about collusion with the meat industry. this is another big, Jim mentioned food safety scandals, and one of the biggest food safety scandals globally last year again was this, what the Brazilian prosecutors called Operation Weak Flesh. And what it referred to was basically dressed up, rotting meat that was exported out of Brazil. I mean, this was supposed to be some of the most disgusting stuff you can imagine. And there were actually bans of having Brazilian imports for a while in the EU and China and elsewhere. They were removed fairly quickly, and the scandal continues. It's basically bribing officials, food safety officials, to be able to just turn a blind eye towards this. So you can imagine the role that exports play for this industry. And it's really critical to understand this, especially because JBS is one of the really dominant companies in the United States. It's one of the top 4 when it comes to beef in the US, that controls the market in the US. Pilgrim's Pride, which is another company in the US, is owned by JBS. So JBS is very present in the US, and in the last couple of weeks, there have been several scandals in the United States on recalling JBS beef, like an insane amount of JBS beef. I can't remember. It's like 50,000 pounds or something crazy like that. So I think it's an important thing to remember. One of the other things I want to bring up, which we talk about in our report, is slave labor and the use of slave labor in this chain. So it's not just animal welfare concerns, but also human rights issues involved in this chain, where these poultry catchers are hired by middlemen to catch. I mean, try to imagine trying to catch chickens. And these guys have like 18-hour shifts. They don't get much food or water. They're basically just trapped into this. And a similar problem, this is from our colleagues from Reporter Brazil, which is an investigative journalism NGO that's looked at a lot at human rights abuses. And cattle raising is one of the areas where slave labor was pretty rampant and continues to be. You know, out there in these wide areas where there's nobody there for miles, these guys are left there to tend to cattle, and basically atrocious living conditions and wages. So I wanted to just bring up this whole idea about how have all these deforestation agreements worked. Cattle and this whole livestock industry is a big reason for deforestation in the Amazon, and of course the feed that goes into all of these, all of this production, and including feed going to China. And what some such studies have been finding is that there's been so much leakage out of this to neighboring states, but also laundering. What they do is they take cattle that has been in an uncertified and an illegal operation, and then funnel it somewhere in the supply chain to one that has been certified. So it's called laundering cattle to avoid scrutiny in these deforestation agreements. And the impact of this, of course, is that it's actually changing. This whole deforestation, this whole cycle is having a dramatic impact in the ecosystem of South America, because you need these trees to be able to generate the evaporation and the condensation and the moisture in the region. And when that cycle dramatically breaks, what you have is drought. And Brazil has been facing a lot of drought, and these major cities have been facing a lot of drought. So these are also additional components of this whole education towards, I think, Brazilian citizens to understand what does drought have to do with the increasing consumption and production. And I think that there's different things that we can learn from this. Louis referred in the introduction to the study that we've done. This is an infographic we came up with last year where we actually quantified, and the report that came out, it's called Emissions Impossible, quantified the emissions of the 35 largest meat and dairy companies in the world, and you can see JBS right there on top, 280 million tons in 1 year. And number 7 is Marfrig, number 8 is Minerva, number 11 is BRF. These are all Brazilian companies, and we're talking about pretty high levels of emissions. The top 5 meat and dairy companies are producing more than Germany, and also more than Exxon, BP, and Shell, which is here. So you can see JBS is a big player there. And one of the things that we looked at was also how much are they reporting? Are they reporting their emissions at all? And we used a methodology that has actually been used by the Food and Agriculture Organization, the UN organization, FAO. And what we found, you can see JBS, this is what we found that JBS emits, and this is what JBS reports. So it's like 2,000% more or something like that. You know, they're basically reporting 3% of their own emissions, and Marfrig is doing the same, and BRF is doing the same. So important to think about that. But I guess perhaps what's the scariest thing in all of this is really looking forward, and whether this supply or this demand, whichever way you want to look at it, is going down, and it's not. Poultry exports are supposed to increase by 41% over 10 years. Beef and veal, 39%, pork by 30%. And you can see the consumption is also supposed to increase by 30%. And so these are pretty significant numbers. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in Brazil to think about things much more holistically, trying to connect the dots and really looking at how do we get at some of these structural issues to deal with animal welfare attitudes. I don't know if I've made it in my 10 minutes, but I leave this in terms of some of the things and framework that we're thinking about in terms of how do we stop the bad and build the new, and how do we create a just transition. And I think the animal welfare issue is also one critical element of this just transition. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We're now going to move to Q&A, and I think all the panelists will be unmuted for that. First question is to Joe. Building off some of you may have seen in the chat, there's been some chat about the dairy figures for India. To kind of make that a slightly broader question, I'm curious, it seems like in a number of areas there are numbers that look relatively different to what you might see reported in the press. So I know Brazil elsewhere has had reported 8% of the population being vegetarian, or in China there being 50 million vegans. You know, the study finds fewer than 1% or less than 1% in each case. So I'm just curious, why might there be these discrepancies, and is that relevant in the case of dairy in India?
Answering the last part first, I'm not sure if it's relevant in the case of dairy in India, but in other cases, for instance, the higher numbers that we've seen previously for Brazil, for instance, I know that often they ask those things in terms of, are you vegan? Are you vegetarian? And so they're self-reported figures. And you see that in the US as well, that there's a huge discrepancy between the number of people who call themselves vegan or vegetarian and the number that you get if you look at actual consumption of products. And like Che mentioned in the chat, our consumption measure was extremely simple in this study because we had very limited space. It was essentially just, do you ever eat any of these things? And then a list of meat products, fish, dairy, eggs. And so it should be more accurate in terms of the number of vegans and vegetarians that we find as opposed to self-report. But that doesn't necessarily speak to the question that was raised by Satish about the amount of people who say that they aren't eating dairy. And so I was actually going to flip the question around and say to Satish, if I'm not sure, I don't see a panel, but just to ask if that does seem like it's a low number, that only 62% of Indians reported eating anything with dairy, do you have any sense of why that might occur? Is it Do you think it's a lack of understanding of what dairy products are, or just not thinking of it, or deliberate misreporting? Like, where might that come from?
Maybe they think about it as only consume milk, maybe, and they all consume, many other products like ghee, which is like in every single Indian dish. Just to give you, an anecdotal, evidence is that, India is 1.25 billion people. I've made about 3 vegans so far. So it's so unbelievably deeply entrenched in the whole culture, and they don't even know what vegan means. To them, it's just vegetarian. But I guess your study just listed the product, so that's better.
Right.
I don't know why. It's just completely baffling to me that people are saying maybe they don't know what dairy means. I have no idea, because if they mean it means something else, then like ghee and stuff, which almost everybody eats every day. So I don't know. I don't know why the number is coming so low, but I don't have any studies, but it's just, blatantly obvious that number should be at least in the high 90s, if not 99+%. So I don't know why. I don't know why the numbers are coming low. And the second question is, do you have any suggestions of how to address this issue to get people thinking about dairy? Reducing dairy, of course. Yeah.
Sorry, so to reduce dairy consumption, or to measure it more accurately with?
No, the consumption. The consumption of. The measurement, I'm pretty sure it's very high, so I'm not too concerned. But what do you have any suggestions, strategies, to get people? Because we haven't been having any success. Very quickly right now, I think India needs either a miracle, like a product which is cheaper, tastier, so people just eat that and somehow just forget about dairy, unfortunately, or a disaster, like tons of people unfortunately getting sick because of contamination dairy, which I know is very, very high, by the way, in India, is contamination dairy. So there doesn't seem to be any chance of incremental progress in India and dairy, but I could be wrong. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
I'll let the others answer as well, but to me, it seems like, is there a possibility for more emphasis on plant-based alternatives? I know there is a strong culture of vegetarian food in India, but I don't know whether plant-based options are promoted much, if they're available.
Vegetarian includes dairy, so the vegetarian means nothing as far as dairy is concerned. So that's in fact, in India, unfortunately, vegan means nothing, and vegetarian doesn't address the dairy addiction. So both of those don't work in India as far as dairy is concerned. Maybe Shefali can chime in, what her view is.
Well, it's interesting. The Sharma family, Lewis knows this, but my cousin actually was one of the secretariats of the Federation of Indian Animal Protection Organizations.
Yes, Arpan, right? Arpan,
yeah,
of course, yeah. I know.
Arpan's
nice
my
man,
cousin.
Yeah. I didn't know he was your cousin.
Vegan,
Okay, very good.
He's vegan, so I don't know, maybe
Yes.
that's that 1%. But I think there's been a big attempt in India to at least oppose and shut down the mega dairies. I know India has had very big plans to expand dairy, both domestically and abroad and internationally. And
Yes.
And they've done so they've made a number of changes over several decades, and they continue to do that. But I think the plans to do huge mega dairies has been met with resistance, not just from animal welfare organizations, but also other organizations. So I think that's a step in the right direction. Unfortunately, there's also a whole governance issue in India with Modi.
Of course, yeah.
And so the whole issue around meat, not so much dairy, but certainly meat, has been riddled with violence and sectarianism that has become very complicated, I think, for folks on the ground at the moment.
But that's again only mainly meat. Doesn't address the dairy issue at all. Consumption of dairy. That's my question about dairy. I understand the meat issue, but the dairy is totally unaddressed by anybody everywhere.
Cool. Yeah, I want to just, we've only got a few minutes left, so I just want to make sure we cover.
I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, thanks, Tish. Jim, just want to bring you in on, obviously, the trade war between China and the US has been a big factor recently. How do you see that impacting production in China and farm animal welfare in China?
Well, I think there are two oddly related issues that are going on at the same time in China. You have, on the one hand, the trade war, which is affecting soy imports principally. And you also have the huge nationwide outbreak of African swine flu or swine fever, which is a deadly disease that got into China earlier this year and has rapidly spread throughout the country. I think that in the case of the swine fever, it clearly came due to China's globalized and increasingly industrialized animal farming system. Most people think that it came in through imports from Russia, and it has spread because of a lot of long-distance transport of piglets around the country. But the government has blamed it on small farms and backyard farms, and I think that, as was the case with avian flu in the last decade, this is going to lead to more and more concentration of ownership and larger scale of production in China. And so, frankly, I think that it says that advocates for animal welfare will, even more than currently, probably want to focus their efforts on those very large pork-producing companies, and that is where, for instance, Compassion in world farming has focused their efforts with some success. But it's a distressing direction, in my view, for policy to take. The trade war is complicated because, on the one hand, many observers thought it would be very short-lived and have few effects beyond a few months in the springtime, that it would blow over quickly. But it is now looking like it may be part of a transition into a much more serious rift between the US and China, a new Cold War, as some people are calling it. China takes food security extremely seriously, and as tariff and counter-tariff have ramped up, they have taken some serious steps to adjust the way that they're growing soy. There are incentives to promote production of soy, more production of soy domestically, and they're also shifting, obviously adjusting who they import from, and that will definitely have implications for the environment in places like Brazil and South America, where there is a serious problem not only of deforestation for cattle ranching, but also of deforestation for raising soy as animal feed. But China is also doing some interesting things with trying to diversify the feed mix inside the country so that less soy is used. And so those are all things that I think we'll need to track and figure out ways to respond to as we think about environmental and animal welfare effects of these big changes that are happening in the country.
I would just want to add that, and certainly when we were doing the research for Emissions Impossible, looking at concentration figures, what was surprising to see is the role of Chinese companies going up in beef production in Australia and in New Zealand, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got Chinese investors now in Australia and New Zealand mm-hmm. that are actually Chinese and Japanese investors that have really started to dominate in terms of the concentration of a small number of companies controlling a lot of the market. So mm-hmm. I think that's an area to watch as well.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So I think each of our panelists can do another 10 minutes. Correct me if anyone has a hard stop. We are technically at time, so if anyone needs to drop off the call, go for it. Does anyone who's an attendee, not a panelist or me, have a question that they wanted to put to the panelists? Okay, Karen has a question. Karen, do you want to just go on unmute, or do you want me to ask the question?
I'm happy to go on unmute. I'm just wondering, Jim or other panelists, I know that Jim mentioned food safety or food scandals as a focusing on that as like a promising approach in China, and I'm wondering what other promising approaches would there be in the Chinese context?
Oh, there I am. Good question. I think that there are some organizations in China that are not so much concerned with animal welfare, but with environmental and climate impacts of increasing meat consumption and beef consumption. And they have talked about reaching out to celebrity chefs and sort of making consumption of reducing meat consumption more fashionable in that way. But I do think that the health, I mean, obviously we don't want to wish that there would be a beef E. coli contamination scandal in China on the scale that we seem to see frequently at large facilities here in the United States. But I think that when things like that happen, it is an opportunity so that people don't have this notion that beef is the good meat and that other meats are somehow bad. From an animal welfare perspective, I think, again, to the extent that there are ways to link sort of happy animals with better quality food. So not so much saying to people that they shouldn't eat meat, but saying to people that if they're going to eat meat, they should eat meat that's been raised in a way that's not causing them horrible pain throughout their lives. Maybe one avenue to take. And then finally, I do think that, despite all of the attempts to suppress and wipe out traditional sources of Chinese culture, vegetarianism was a very strong tradition in China via Buddhism in former times. And it is experiencing something of a resurgence. And I think that finding ways to tie vegetarianism to Chinese tradition at the same time to present it as something that is modern and exciting, would be another positive approach to take. I know a number of vegans in China and have also seen a number of vegan restaurants. And I think that veganism is very small, but it is starting to take off there. And so I think there is some hope for that as an approach as well.
I also think that, I don't know what you think, Jim, but I also think the health issue is becoming more important in the cities in terms of obesity and even just guidelines from the health ministry. And I don't know to what extent that can be explored more and amplified more in terms of obesity and what are actually healthy levels of consumption.
I would also throw in addition to the motivations for it, I do think that the health angle is probably a good one. But to add in the point that I touched on earlier, which is that normative information may be very powerful in China. So there aren't very many vegans, but like you said, it is an increasing trend. And to the extent that you can focus people's attention on that, on the shift rather than the absolute number, that can be really, really helpful and powerful in encouraging more people to follow along and doing the same thing.
Yeah, I agree on the health question, and I'm sorry, I thought I had mentioned that earlier, but there is definitely, again, the notion of people wanting healthy and safe food far overriding concerns they might have about either environment or animal welfare. And therefore, health becomes the thin end of the wedge for these other concerns that we might consider to be much more important. There was a lot of attention a few years back to a government commission that recommended a big reduction in meat consumption in China. And I'm afraid those kinds of guidelines carry no more weight, probably less weight in China even than here in the United States. And so, I think that there is There is work to be done at the policy level, but a lot of the work really is going to be through the media, through opinion makers, and through making these links to health and safety.
Another issue I wonder that we need to explore more and exploit is the level of antibiotic use and antibiotic resistance. I mean, I think the Chinese government is probably very alarmed about it. To what extent it's alarmed, we won't ever know. Maybe Jim knows, but I think this is an area that is also really important to highlight, both in terms of the use in China, which is just, you know, of course, anything little or small in China is huge by global standards. But also just the role of antibiotic resistance in other parts of the world, particularly since China is one of the few countries that has seen deaths related to zoonotic diseases. And although that has nothing to do with the antibiotic resistance, but I think that the connection of this kind of model, the mass production, and what can go wrong in terms of a health perspective, just what's intrinsically involved in this model, I think is an important one to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, I'm conscious that we are 10 minutes past the hour, and I think we've covered a lot of good ground. So if anyone wants to follow up with any of the panelists, I think that Jim and Joe have already put their emails in the chat line, and if Shefali is happy to be contacted, she can do so too. So feel free to follow up with folks on the call, and thank you to our panelists. I think that was really interesting today. So thank you, Joe, Jim, Shefali, and yeah, I hope this is the start of an ongoing conversation about what we can do in the BRIC nations. Cool.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Louis.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Louis. Bye.
Thanks.